Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. And today I am very, very lucky and honored because I have two very special guests here today. We're going to be talking about a book that, as Jane looks around, is like, who's special? Not me. We're going to be talking about a book both of them wrote called Who Wants the Whale, which Laura is holding up right there. Now we need a third. There we go. There we go. We all got one. Which is a really wonderful book that I really loved. That is a satirical look at the behind the scenes of some of the AAA game industry. Though, as we'll probably talk about, in some ways, to me, it didn't feel satirical at all. Which is part of the scary part of it. But yeah, let me just introduce both of you. Would you like to just say who you are and what you do, and yeah, and how you know each other, which might be the most interesting part.
How do you, my dear?
Oh, okay. My name's Laura Kate Dale. I am a full-time video game critic and author. I have been writing about video games and making videos and podcasts and whatnot on the internet for, I think, 8 or 9 years now. It's been my full-time job. But I've also written several books in the past. I've written Uncomfortable Labels, which was a memoir about living at the intersection of being trans and autistic. Gender Euphoria, which was a anthology of positive gender affirming stories from trans people around the world. Other video game books have included Things I Learned from Mario's Butt, which is an illustrated coffee table book of butt reviews.
Very important. You're doing very important work. Very important.
It's the most serious journalism I've ever done.
Of course. Yeah.
I wrote a children's book about gender dysphoria called Me and My Dysphoria Monster. And most recently with Jane, I wrote Who Hunts the Whale? Jane, introduce yourself.
Me, I'm Jane Areith McDale. Our relationship is we got married. We did a marriage on each other. On a train, no less.
Yes, very, very famously. It was great.
It's very weird to have had a newsworthy wedding.
I mean, I thought it was lovely. It's every time I saw a picture, I'm like, this looks amazing and wonderful.
Yes, and occasionally getting beset by people going, "Oh, you're the train lesbians." That's us.
It was a very strange week or two after that. Like we got recognized in a shop. Someone who lived down our street was like, "Oh, it's the train lesbians."
It's hysterical and lovely. I aspire to be known. I aspire to be known as one of the train lesbians. That sounds wonderful.
One day, I believe in you.
But yeah, anything else to introduce yourself to?
I've done all sorts. I stream, I write, I have written board game reviews and video game reviews. I make music, I design t-shirts, and I'm just generally silly on the internet, hopefully for people's entertainment.
That's generally my role too. I go like, I'm just a giant dork on the internet dancing for people's amusement, and occasionally I say hopefully good things, meaningful things, I guess I should say. But yeah, I wanted to have you both on because I wanted to obviously talk about the novel, but I guess the best place to start would be like, number one, what sort of got you into doing the idea for this novel? Like, what made you want to do it? And then kind of jumping off of that one is what made you two want to work together on this one?
Well, we've done a podcast together called Queer and Pleasant Strangers for about 5 years now. And one of the recurring skits we've done on that is basically two execs from the boardroom of a company that used to be called Electronic Active Softworks. And
what you're talking about.
Then the publishers, when we came to designing the book, were like, "You can't call it that." It's like, okay, fine, we'll change it. But it was like the one running skit. We were like, if we were going to do a book together, that's probably the one that would be something that would be fun to work on as like more long form fiction. And also we have more to say about the video game industry that can't really be conveyed in a 3 to 5 minute skit about people being terrible. So we battered our heads together over what is a year in video games.
Yeah, of the various like skits we'd sort of been doing week in, week out on this podcast, this was the one that felt most like it was a solid foundation that a world could be built around. And it's one of those things that, like, as a recurrent skit, it came about originally because I am one of the hosts on a video game podcast called Podquisition, and a big part of what we try and do is like focus on not shying away from the stories of industry, terrible behavior, crunch, abuse, whatnot that go on, and sort of acknowledge that those happen. And it's emotionally draining to week in, week out have to be like, okay, here's another company that's done something terrible I have to emotionally reckon with. And
the
like
same things
that's
over and over and over again in circles too.
yeah,
Yeah. Sorry.
exactly. No, no, no. And that skit was very much like I needed an outlet to like to engage with that stuff in a slightly more light-hearted way, like with a bit of distance. And Jane, like that it's often it was your sort of introduction to, oh, is this what's going on with the industry now? And yeah, it's something that like we'd batted about the idea of doing a book together at some point for a while, and this was the one that like we landed on and went, we could probably make a book out of this.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So how did you get to like doing it, telling the story the way you did? Because for listeners, if you haven't read the book, the way the story is told is it is kind of diary entries from a new employee who starts off as like a lower level executive assistant at the company called Supremacy Software, which again is not meant to evoke any specific company, I'm sure. And it's sort of told as a diary entry over the course, as you say, of about a year. So how did you settle on that versus sort of like a different perspective or something like that?
I think it was mostly about how there is this sort of annual cycle in video games, the getting out whatever the annual version of big name game is.
Which in this case is
So,
Call of Shooty, which is
oh yes,
again
which
Definitely not a
could be
reference
anything.
to
anything at all, anything at all. Very subtle. I appreciated it.
So we basically sat down and was like, what is a year in video games? What are like the big things that just happen every single year, the big conventions, the different types of conventions, trying to hit the release schedule, and rather sadly has come true since we published the book, the annual departure of developers at the beginning of the year. So we from that it was like, well, we've got a year set out. This is kind of a diary.
Yeah, structurally it made sense for us because like if you're going to write a book like this and have it feel authentic to people who are aware of the cycle of what happens with video games, to tell it in a way that didn't sort of follow that structure of what a year in video games has become felt like it wouldn't be a good fit. But obviously, the video game industry ebbs and flows with how frequently things happen. And at least part of it was that having this structure of like diary entries that could sort of jump around a little bit through the year and could hop forward to significant events and didn't have to be tied to a lot of more traditional narratives have to take place in a relatively shortened period of time because there constantly has to be something happening in the main character's life that is pushing the story forward every moment. And this allowed us to keep that sort of feel of pace without, having to go, there were several weeks at a time when nothing particularly eventful happened, and then
yep. The part that like intrigued me most, and it kind of reminded me why am I blanking on, is Jason Schreier recently wrote a book that was I forget the title of it. It's not Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, this recent one, but a lot of what he talked about in that book was like how people enter into the video game industry really excited and then sort of get churned out because of all the stuff that like goes on in the video game industry. And one of the best parts of this book that I found was really fascinating, especially with your main character, was they started off like really excited to join Supremacy Software. Like they're a big fan, they play the games, and so they come to the company and just start to like slowly see what's been going on. So I'm curious like your thoughts on that journey for the character and what it was like to just see the like disillusionment happen as she went along.
I know for me, there's a few things that were sort of inspiration there to that sort of tone. I've known people who have gone to work at big AAA video game studios, people I grew up with, went to school with, who I've had really in-depth conversations with about like them very excitedly joining these companies and getting really burnt out really quickly by poor upper management behavior of varying kinds. Jason Schreier's work is fantastic and I think has done a great job for getting a lot of those kind of stories out there.
And it's the
it,
book is Press Reset: Ruin Recovery in the
yes,
Video Game Industry. I just looked it up
yeah.
real quick, so that's the one I was.
Um,
Sorry, didn't mean
yeah,
to cut you.
yeah, no, that's all right. And like other than that, like part of it was just myself. Like I know I came into this industry very excited, and you know, 8, 9 years ago when I started doing this full time, I didn't anticipate how much of my job would become having to engage with the worst aspects of how this art form is made.
Mm-hmm.
There is, without too many spoilers, quite late in the book, there is a email written by a journalist that is just me having a bit of a like get feelings off my chest about how depressing it is to like get into video games because you love games and then find out they're made on the back of terrible practices. You know,
Yeah.
a few different angles that have all come to the like, yeah, excitement gets burned out of you here.
Yeah. Oh, Jane, I want to give you a chance to answer that question first.
Well, for me, I think it's almost my kind of story as well. Of a few years ago, I was someone who was just like, yay, new video game. I'm very happy for this. And as time has gone on, listening to like Podquisition, the work of Stephanie Sterling, reading Jason Schreier's articles about the horribleness within the industry, and just going, well, now I need to basically be really careful about what I'm buying, what I'm recommending to people, because I don't want to support an industry that is abusing people. So I
Yeah.
play more indies, but perhaps that's because there's just generally less news about them.
Yeah, no, I've had a similar experience too with like both the video game industry and also the film industry, because I've kind of worked in both, and seeing what it's done to friends of mine, and then just also seeing it from like just the company side and then also journalist side, because I did stuff with GameSpot, is it's depressing a lot of the time, but then there's still some hopeful stuff that you know, you do see with like indie work and smaller studios generally, and you do find elements of that throughout this book, which I'm just sort of curious to see, like you're thinking of like making sure you incorporated some hope in all the darkness that's in this book.
I think it was a difficult challenge because we wanted it to not have a super positive ending,
Mm-hmm.
because that, like, up until like even before we'd finished this, because I think we started this in November 21,
Mm-hmm.
so like the first draft was submitted at that point, and we very much wanted it to be okay. Well, at the moment we're not seeing unions getting together, we're not seeing any of this actually happening. And also from a point of view of, we don't want to be like, hey, we're just two random people who don't work in the, like, directly in the industry, we will show you the correct way to fix your problems.
Yeah.
It's like, we can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to be realistic about the fact that like there is a big problem and there is no easy fix and it's going to be a long way to solve, but we also didn't want to get bogged down in being too miserable. And you know, the way we sort of went about that was we wanted some humor and some levity, and we tried to make space in the book for humor and for, you know, those moments of exaggeration to sort of keep some levity in there. But it was also about there were times where we could have gone darker with the book and we deliberately didn't, because we were like, we didn't feel it was necessary to tell the kind of story we were trying to tell. There was a particular moment I remember in the writing process where we were going back and forth with a development editor, which is someone that sort of looks over the overall arcing story and sort of gives their overall thoughts. And one of their bits of feedback was later in the book, when some of the more intense things are being detailed, she's going, well, wouldn't it be more interesting if like they were described as happening like in the moment? And we were like, no, we don't need to describe traumatic events happening in detail for you in order to get across really bad stuff happens, and like that the fact it happens at all is shocking enough. We don't need to linger in misery or like use that for entertainment. What is important is there are human beings going through these things and trying to give some sense of hope of like, it's rough, but there are things that we can do as people to deal with the terror that is capitalism.
Yeah. And kind of speaking on that too, one of the interesting things that I found was just from that perspective of your main character, who does have access to more than a person would have at a company like this, to like getting to see what the executives say, getting to sort of get to different areas of the company, getting to see sort of like the like larger picture within the company. But also, as you say, there's like moments where even she's just sort of like, oh, I kind of had an inkling that was happening, but I didn't really know for sure. And then sort of like when stuff comes to light during the journalistic aspects later in the book, she's sort of like, oh yeah, I definitely see how that could have happened, and how disgusting it is. And I thought that kind of, for me, captured that aspect of like, when you work at a company, you're not going to know everything. You're not going to see everything, but you're sort of like, yeah, I get that this is the vibe that the company is going for. And I'm curious sort of like like that aspect of what you chose to depict and what you didn't from this character's perspective.
I think the perspective for that really helped anyway. It was because I've written horror before, and there's certain subjects I was just like, I'm not going to touch on these things because I don't want to traumatize people who listen to it, other than, you know, all the other psychological stuff. But there are certain things I will not touch. And I think that's fine. And I think I wouldn't have wanted to tell that kind of, or explain that kind of thing happening in the first person, even though our development editor was like, yes, why don't you have it happen to the main character? I was like, no, I don't want it to be that story. I want there to be the option also for the fact that that character doesn't know everything. And because of her position, a lot of people won't necessarily trust her, because from their point of view, she's just another manager or in with the execs, and therefore not to be trusted.
She falls under the common advice of HR is there for the company, not for you.
Yep.
It's one of those things that I think it, or I hope came across with it doing it that way, was that no matter how much access someone has to being in multiple places in a company, if even they don't know everything that's going on and don't get a complete picture, then what chance does the average person who sat working at their desk in their one part of the office, never moving around, going to have of knowing how bad things have gotten, and as such knowing that they need to stand up and help change things? Yeah, if someone with that much access to the company doesn't know everything that's going on, what chance does anyone else have of having the kind of big picture you need to mobilize, you know, solidarity and support within those kind of companies?
I agree. And kind of speaking on the perspective angle, and it kind of goes to where this started at. One of the when I first started reading the book, I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. And was one of my favorite / least favorite parts of the book, depending on how you want to look at it, was getting to see how the executives sort of like spoke to each other and about the company. And in being honest, I mean this in a very good way. It gave me a lot of anxiety just listening to or reading what you had written. And yeah, it was very good. So I wanted to ask you both about like how you went about writing that stuff. Was it like drawing upon your skits, or was it like new stuff, or sort of like looking at the industry? I'm curious.
So Laura wrote a basic outline for the entire story, start to finish, and added in, I think, almost all of the press releases, all of the news articles. Obviously, being a video game journalist, that was perfect position for that. And I just went through and wrote most of the dialogue and most of the jokes. And anytime we were sort of told through the development edit to add extra bits, either I was just able to do it on my own, or we sat down on a Wednesday morning, hit record on Audacity, and just did voices at each other for an hour or so.
on the last sort of pass of the book, there was almost a whole day we spent with just a microphone pointed at us, and we were like, here is a list of highlighted sections where we want to get more dialogue in and work out how we want to do this. And we just put on silly voices and talked at each other about the topic that we needed to convey. And not all of it came across one-to-one, but it was a good exercise in getting the tone and the cadence and the personality and sort of working out like the linguistic quirks of how these people communicate with each other. But a lot of that stuff has its origins in the way we sort of performed these characters in the original skit they came from, which was at least from my perspective, like the way that they communicate is not necessarily accurate to how executives communicate, but it is, from an outside perspective, I can only imagine executives talking in these kind of terms, because I can't imagine anyone being able to do the kinds of terrible actions you have to do to so many people to do what you do as an executive without being this kind of cartoonish villain. Because the alternative is, I think, far scarier, that this is just very calm, quiet, not even more calculated and less cartoonish is a scarier thought.
It was one of the aspects, like I said, like that's the satirical part of the novel, but then I'm sitting here being like, this feels like very real to how I imagine these people actually talk. And I know it's not. I know it's much more of the even more dehumanizing, like these people are just cogs, like making the financial decision without recognizing the human cost. But it's like the only way I can process it is like a person. And I think you capture that, which is why I actually was reading and I was just like noticed like, oh man, I'm feeling like kind of anxiety just reading this thing, which I think is well captured. I'd say that with a lot of appreciation for how well you captured all of that. And the other aspect that I thought was funny, but also dark, was that they weren't just in competition, or you didn't just see like the competition with other companies or how they manipulated their own employees, but like the competition between each other and how they all didn't they all distrust each other, and how that expressed itself through caffeine, which was I love that recurring thing throughout the book of like you taking note of how much caffeine each person has in their drink and how it like constantly increases to ridiculous levels. And I'm wondering how you sort of came up with that that idea for the book.
I think it was just the idea, or it almost sort of spawned from the same place, that banality of evil, and it could either be sort of hand rubbing, he, we're going to do something awful, or just we don't actually care, and that complete lack of care or compassion for anyone who doesn't have as much money as them or who is going to give them that much money just seemed like, well, what do they do to entertain themselves? They torture employees, and they think it's funny and just light-hearted entertainment. And also they've got just this stupid little thing going on of, yeah, we'll make my coffee stronger because I'm better than them. But and ultimately that is as far as they want to go, because Rick and Chad are just very happy to be kind of the same level, without too many spoilers for later in the book.
It's one of those things where the coffee orders was like a nice repeatable microcosm of, honestly, I think it summarizes everything to do with executive culture, which is, I arbitrarily want a higher number than you, whether I actually need that or not, and whether it is functionally going to serve me any purpose. I get my value from knowing I have more than everyone else, and I don't care who that inconveniences below me, as long as I get to feel superior. Executive corporate climbing and attempts at seeking perpetual growth at the expense of workers, or a huge coffee order that they're not even properly drinking at the expense of a PA. It's the same core experience, I think.
It's trying to find the logical progression for people who treat their bank balances as a high score. How do you carry that through the rest of your life? Well, coffee, I guess. And also from a time when I was working ridiculous hours and I used to drink like 3 or 4 16-shot lattes a day. Until my heart nearly stopped.
Oh, fun.
Don't do that.
I used to work at Starbucks, and I'm not a morning person. So every morning I would get there, I would have like an 8-shot thing of espresso if I worked mornings. It's like, I need this or else I'm going to not be able to be functioning, which was probably a bad move for my health. So yeah. But that was actually kind of the next note that I wanted to touch upon really briefly, was like, I do like that, again, these are very cartoonish figures. But there's still an element of like, you have some empathy for them through the main character being like, this is bad for their health. and you sort of showcase how it's, without spoiling too much, how it is like toxic thing even to these people. And you don't like say like, oh, maybe we should care about them in the book, but you sort of point out like how this is just a horrible thing for any human being to exist within, even terrible, disgusting ones.
I think it's just trying to talk about who Avery is as a person.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't like them at all, but also she's not the kind of person that's going to go, oh, yes, I will deliberately poison their coffee or whatever.
Yeah. I think the thing that it boils down to is those executives are more than happy to dehumanize human beings who don't serve a purpose to them or that they don't like, but we wanted to have a protagonist who, even with people this monstrous and villainous, people who need taking down, who need something done to them, that she still struggles to dehumanize them. They're still human beings, and that is something that for you would hope for the average person would be hard to process, the fact that like terrible humans are still humans.
Yeah. And I kind of go, speaking of like people as humans, kind of jumping off the executives, I did really like how we got to, throughout the book, get different pockets of the company and the people who work there, and people who would uphold the company, people who wouldn't. So you have like legal and HR as like two sections that very much like held up the company line. In ways that, again, there's scenes in there where like, I've had that meeting, I know exactly what that feels like emotionally from an HR person. That sucks. But again, captured really well. So curious, like, you're thinking about like drawing out those characters in that side of the company.
I think with HR,
Go ahead.
I think with HR, it was our main character was the perfect person to see that from both sides, because she had the going for her own interview, then sitting in on the other interviews and seeing that for the HR person or the head of HR, it was, again, just a game, a smaller game, but again, just a petty game of power. And then once again, later on, getting chewed out for trying to do something and seeing just how bad it can go.
Yeah. And again, it's like, it's certainly not to imply that all HR people are terrible and evil, but when we were first drafting this book, a lot of the early drafting was going on around the time that a lot of the Ubisoft mistreatment of workers stuff was breaking. And one recurrent theme in a lot of those Ubisoft discussions was abuse being reported to HR, and HR often burying stories to protect upper management, often actively not passing things further up the chain and not progressing them if they were going to harm upper management. There were like multiple stories back to back, just within one company, of HR acting as a shield for the executive class rather than serving to protect the average worker. And that definitely played a lot into portraying the kind of power dynamic that an HR person can have in a worst case scenario if they choose to abuse that position. And the fact that that is a depressingly common reality, it seems, in this industry.
Yeah. One other aspect, kind of jumping off of that, to talk about specifically the video game industry, I really found fascinating, and again, it's very true about the like work that a lot of developers have to do to even just make like the focus on making like a vertical slice for something like E3 or X3, as you have in the book, and like just like, oh, here's everything that we're going to present to the world, but it's not even representative of what the game actually is. And it's sort of like it's funny because you make references to other games that I'm like, I wonder what you're referencing here, like an Alien type of game that looked like it sort of misled people when it showcased trailers and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, I wonder what that is referencing at all. But yeah, no, I sort of like the fact that a lot of what goes on at these big companies is trying to present stuff that looks good without actually like worrying about what the game actually is. And so I wanted to toss it to both of you to sort of talk about like that aspect of the gaming industry, of like how companies sort of think about making games of this size?
I may be the better one to jump in on this because like a lot of the experience in the book of like hands-on with vertical slice stuff comes from partly from having done many years of being given sort of polished slices of games to see at shows like E3 and then seeing finished releases, but also over the years I've done other kinds of work in the industry that have involved seeing games in much earlier states and being in that sort of that rare position of sometimes seeing this is what the game is actually like right now, and here is the most recent trailer they put out for the game that shows something that looks night and day, a million miles away from what is actually playable right now. And a lot of the time it's not malicious, in that the average person playing video games has spent decades never being shown what unfinished video games in progress actually look like, and therefore if you show representative demos of what games look like, people will talk about how like this looks like unplayable garbage. A great example. Yeah, I was about to say GTA 6 is a perfect example of this.
I was just about to say that too. Yeah.
Yeah, all of that leaked GTA 6 footage last year. I watched that and went, "Oh no, this is very much a real, actual demo of an unreleased game, and it is looking surprisingly playable." Like, unless you've seen these and like had the experience of like knowing how to see what that means for a future title, I understand how the industry got here, but it doesn't change the fact that a lot of companies do use it as a real crutch for promising things they can't necessarily keep. And I'm glad that that has become less common over time, but we still see examples. There's at least one game last year that I saw in a very early state that had a very polished demo, and that was the only part of the game that got polished, and everything outside of the demo content in the full game was just going to not be polished at all. And those kind of things are like weirdly common still, despite big examples of pushback. That doesn't seem to have scared developers away from that model.
Yeah, and I mean, I recently watched the Psych Odyssey documentary series, which is for listeners is the kind of behind the scenes series that they did for Psychonauts 2. And even in that, one of the aspects of that was like polishing up a level that was going to be shown off at E3. And even that sort of like resulted in a lot of stress for people, even though that company was trying better about trying to avoid that aspect of crunch culture. But still, like, because it's so indicative throughout the industry, it still results in it.
That's the thing. Like, even if it is indicative of what the final product will be, even in cases like Psychonauts 2, it still is one of those things where you have to, by this date, it absolutely has to look like a finished game, because the audience has been trained to expect nothing less out of those kind of demos. And anything that doesn't come across as if it is a finished product is not good enough for an in-progress demo build. And that puts a lot of pressure on workers.
Yeah, which sucks, because I mean, part of, for me, like watching that documentary was like watching the fascinating part was like watching like the white box phase and things like that, being like, this, I can see where this final game ends up, but it's just like all it is just like little white boxes representative of stuff. And I wish we got to see more of that as an industry, because I find that fascinating to see.
It's why I still love that X-Men Origins Wolverine video that you can find online, where the visual effects aren't done yet, and it's a bunch of unfinished VFX scenes. That's fascinating. I love seeing that.
No, I get is like a person who does like reviews. I sometimes get screeners of stuff, and they'll sometimes send me the unfinished screeners, and I'll be like, the VFX template here, and I find that fascinating, just to get to see a peek behind the curtain of like the process, how the sausage is made. But yeah, it kind of going into that, like the dehumanizing aspect of that, how you have like the executive sort of putting one poor person actually working on the game and the rest sort of being like focused on just the presentational aspects of it. And then also another aspect of it too that I found fascinating, and I'm curious to hear you both speak to it, is the sort of like corporate minded thinking of just like stealing from other people. Like you literally have at one point in several points in the book, you have our main character sort of like going around and seeing all the cool innovations that are happening on an indie level, a smaller level, and then sort of like going to the executives like, oh yeah, this is the cool thing, and then the executives like, oh yeah, put that in the game, without any realization of how much it would take to implement or how it matches up with the game that they quote unquote want to make. And so yeah, I'm curious you're thinking about like that sort of mindset within this.
I think there's a couple of things. There is, first of all, we've heard a lot from various reports about management that just don't understand video games at all. To them, it's just, how do we get paid this year? And there's no understanding of what it actually takes to do that. So the idea of just like, we'll just throw a vertical slice together. You just get a few people to do that. There's always more people, right? Because people are a resource that we can just get. It doesn't matter.
Just get as much out of
Yeah,
the bring as much as we can. Yeah.
they don't need time. Nah, that's nonsense. Just get on with it. They'll knock that out in what, an afternoon, and just between the complete lack of understanding, or maybe just a minor amount of understanding, and what if it's just another way we can expect too much from somebody, bully them for not having crunched themselves enough, and then demand even more as a result.
Mm-hmm. It just speaks a lot to like something I think you articulated well in the novel of like how much executives say don't really understand the company that they work at and what they do, and how much they're just capitalist people just trying to make money and make number go up, as opposed to people who understand what it actually takes to make the game that they're working on, which I thought you captured very well. And another probably the standout part of the novel for me, and I'm curious like what got you to this idea, because it is great in a awful sort of way, is you have a section of the book that is the paintball session of the novel, which not to spoil too much for listeners, but there's a section of the novel where the executives sort of go, well, we need to give people a break because they've been working so hard. What do? Oh, we'll go and play paintball, and just sort of drag them out in the middle of the day, delay them being able to work on the game, and force them into this like really like violent act for our own amusement. It is quite literally, I think, one of the standout sections of the novel, because I think it like symbolizes so much of what you were doing in the rest of the book. And so I'm just sort of curious, like what led to that aspect of the novel, because I thought it was very clever.
I think it.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was waiting for you. I think it comes partly from the, like, we've heard a lot from like journalists who are squirreled away to a secret location to do some airsofting, where we've dressed a bunch of people up as racially questionable people that we're just going to shoot and say are all terrorists, and we're going to scream and there'll be loud explosions. But didn't you have a wonderful time? Say nice things about our game. It was partly that, and partly weird corporate team building exercises. And I think at some point we mentioned something about building a bridge out of pasta, which is something I've been forced to do at a random work event once. I was like, I'm so glad it wasn't something like that, but also, and then just my experiences of airsofting and just going, this is horrible. Why did my boss bring me here?
Yeah, it's one of those things where there's obviously a bunch of things that we've pastiched there from some of them are more sort of press focused, event focused. Like, I've been to press events where I was told, yep, come play the game, interview the developers, and then I arrived and was put into a jumpsuit and told to go get shot at with paintballs, which is not a fun thing to be ambushed with without warning. But also part of it was wanting to have some event outside of the office that could sort of recontextualize some of the themes we'd been building up in the office, and give the executives a contextual framework where it was perhaps more acceptable for them to use their power imbalance in more obvious ways, in order to sort of foreshadow where the book is going. That having a setup like paintball, something where there is an expectation of people being able to inflict harm and injury on other people, and making sure to reflect the sort of structural inequalities in the experiences of both sides of that, gave us an opportunity to show sort of the some of the more callous side of where those characters were going in a context where it would be harder to justify just how much they'd abused their position. Something that like was an escalation without being a point that would cause the main character to instantly have to walk away, but also that was like, this is a definite escalation I need to act upon.
Yeah,
and also not wanting to do that direct thing of we've heard a lot from I think Ubisoft and others of there was a lot going on around the office where managers were like badly photoshopping people and that sort of thing. It's like, I don't want to directly do that. What's the next best thing that we can move like lad culture, but make it sort of more direct?
Yeah, we wanted something that had that sort of like lad culture vibe without being I believe it was Quantic Dream that had some really offensive stuff, because like that would have been a bit too much of an escalation that early in the book, but we wanted that same sort of vibe of ha ha ha, this is hilarious for everyone except the people being targeted in the moment.
It is kind of sad that you have to say like, oh, we thought that this thing that actually happened was too much of an escalation for a book. That's frustratingly sad. Yeah.
It was the most difficult part of writing this book in many ways, was trying to go, how do we do exaggerated acts of evil without being overly depressing, but also, the reality of the industry is really depressing, and we don't want to be quite as depressing as just replicating the actual things that happened.
Yeah, no, I think
it is a tough line to walk.
Like I was saying, this book is, it says on the front like it's a satirical novel, and I do think it is quite funny, and I think you satirize the industry very well. But like I said before, in a lot of ways, it feels like, yeah, no, this is just a fictional company that I could very easily see existing in this form, which is sad to say. But kind of getting to kind of more towards the end without spoiling too much, there's one actual aspect I want to kind of make sure I touch upon before I get towards the ending, and I'll give a spoiler warning when we get there. But speaking of lad culture, as you said, one of the darker aspects of it is the kind of online harassment. You have one character, a queer woman, experience online harassment, kind of be thrown under the bus as a woman who sort of became prominent and visible in the industry, and then just a lot of the harassment that came her way, which is unfortunately very very realistic in a lot of different ways to the gamer world. And so I wanted to ask you both about, because I think you handled it, both of you handled it very sensitively and understandingly, and I'm sort of curious about how that sort of went about, as I'm sure like both of you have probably experienced some level of that, as have I in my own way too, with that. So I'm curious how you went about writing that section.
I was very cautious of not wanting this to come across as making sensationalist fiction out of other people's experiences. Over the last few years, I've seen things like, hypothetically, I've heard rumblings of people trying to make films about Gamergate, for example, and like fictionalized stories and things like that. And it's one of those things where I'm always very cautious of taking things that people have gone through and too directly using them for content, as it were. But I think for my side of things, I tried to just draw on things that I've personally been through and try to root it in my own experiences, because those are the things that I can talk about from a place of knowledge. Like I've been that person who's had to go, my phone number's out there somehow, and I've got terrible messages like blowing up my phone, and I don't know what to do. I've been in that position of having to do the sudden panicked do I have two-factor authentication on everything to make sure that
Mhm.
I'm safe? I've had to do the hand off social media to someone else to handle for a while, because like I'm not going to do myself any favors if I try and keep on top of it, but I feel like I need to in case something legitimately threatening comes up. And I think that I've experienced enough of those things that like I felt comfortable talking about those in a non-sensationalist way, because they are things that I know how they feel. And you know, it's I tried to I tried my best to make it a scene where it's the character involved had the kind of support that I really could have done within that moment, and hoped that that would sort of carry it through.
Yeah. And I think kind of this will get to the next element of what I wanted to talk about. Like I do appreciate like while you satirize the corporate culture throughout the book, you do also have moments throughout the book of like, well, if this is what happened, this is how it should be handled, as like the sort of people having to deal with a shitty situation as best they can. And I do appreciate that that's a sort of recurrent aspect throughout the book. And I think one of the ways that I really liked was, and I guess a kind of vague spoiler warning here for listeners, if you want to read the book, though, we'll sort of stay kind of general, I'm sure. Is towards the end of the novel, you do have our lead character reach out to a journalist. And one of the things that I really liked about that section is it kind of showcased like how a journalist should handle situations like that, and what it means to the people who are coming forward with these sort of things. So I'm curious to both of you to sort of speak about like that aspect of like handling like journalistic integrity when you're dealing with these sort of really dark and dangerous issues that involve people having to risk their lives, both professional and personal, to be able to come forward.
I think for me, I've heard enough or seen reported enough of the stories where it has felt like it's been reported in a sensitive and respectful manner, that I was like, well, I want to capture that in the best possible way and how I think it should be done, because obviously I don't have the experience of having to have broken a story like that, and also just trying to be respectful, and Avery just trying to be somebody who wants to do the best, and also for the longest time wants to be this big hero. She sees herself as
Taking on the final
Link
bosses.
or whoever as this main character in her own video game, and that she thinks she's saving the world and she needs a weapon to do that. And it's wrong-headed in many ways, but it's the only thing that occurs to her.
Yeah. I've on the journalism side, like not usually in the context of such serious topics as whistleblowing about company abuse, but I've had my fair share of dealing with sources who have information to share that they are legally not in a position where they can share, and the kind of conversations that happen back and forth around reassuring someone that you will balance needing to know enough about them to verify what they're saying, but equally wanting to respect the fact that, like, first and foremost, the most important thing is to protect their privacy and secrecy, and to put their sort of needs in that regard above anything else in how you work on the story. And I've had enough of those back and forth conversations to know the kind of things that people are scared about and why, and how you have to balance being in the middle often with an editor that's like, I want more concrete information, I need this to be more concrete, and a source that does not want to give more than they're currently giving, and being in the middle of, I know what I know, but I cannot share my sourcing further than I need to, because every additional person that's shared to is another person who could be the broken link of the chain that gets someone fired or sued or worse. And it's one of those things that, like, I've had enough of those conversations to, I would like to think, have a good handle on what is needed to look after sources in those kind of situations.
Yeah. And I did appreciate certain aspects of it that you go into further detail on how it's not just anonymizing people's names, but even things like people being able to figure out, like, well, this journalist has this piece of information, only one person could have had that piece of information. So things like, you have recording in the book that the main character like cuts off towards the beginning because she doesn't want to reveal that she started recording because she knew it was going to happen, this meeting that was going to happen, because she was one of the few people that knew it was going to be a thing. So she had to sort of set it off as like a recording that was going to happen in the middle that someone had turned on. And even like thinking that minutely, I thought was, I think, an important part of like showcasing how difficult it can be to sort of protect your sources and protect yourself in aspects of whistleblowing.
Exactly.
Wanting to inhabit that character and my own native paranoia. What would I do in that situation? How would I try and protect myself? How would I go about that in probably an overly cautious way? But at that point, because I think one of the early comments from the development editor was, why hasn't your character just left? If it's so bad, why haven't they just left? And we hopefully by the end pushed enough of, the character has left her home, taken out a huge loan, put herself in a situation where this could destroy her life, potentially one or both of her parents' lives. Just that's it forever. There is no further hope of doing anything or getting out of their small town. And how would you react to that? And hopefully we did okay with that.
No, I think you did. You captured the element of, it's funny that your editor said that, why wouldn't they just leave? Because in my experience, there's a lot of things that companies like this do, and just our society at large does, to sort of make people feel like they have to stay in a very abusive situation like this. So it's like, are you gonna be able to pay your bills? There's a lot of like indoctrination of like this, as you use Seth, like, we're a family, you don't want to betray your family, or you care about this game, like, oh, you deal with all of this stuff, but you really care about you get to make art, you get to work on Call of Duty, and so all of those tactics that are sort of used again by companies and also society writ large in a capitalist world, that sort of force people to stay in these really horrific and toxic and abusive situations. And I think you both really capture that very well.
I think it helps we've both been homeless. So we do very much understand the conform or be homeless and be in that situation again. So yeah, very much understanding that fear of possible complete ruination again.
So to kind of end, you do have a bittersweet ending, but even before then it kind of gets very dark, because you do have the naivety of the main character sort of being like, yeah, this expose is going to come out and it'll destroy them, and we'll have won the day. And I was reading the section like, oh, you sweet summer child, which was very sad, but like realistic again. And sort of, I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on the sort of like not nihilistic, so the like cynical aspect of the industry, where it's like this stuff comes out and then the very next day the company can get 10 out of 10s in the review scores for the game, things like that.
Yeah, or have your pre-order commercials on the same webpage advertising your expose.
Or saying like, oh, well, we're just reviewing the game. We didn't talk about the ethics of the game. We just have to review the game on its own. As I look at certain companies that have done things like that.
I think my perspective on this is very much that it's natural and human to have those moments of nihilism's maybe not the right word, but those moments of feeling a bit defeated and a little like, this is terrible and no one seems to care, and I feel like I'm the only one who is paying attention to how bad these things are, or is caring about the, like, you know, to think more than just shiny new video game I'd like. And I think the way I came into this was like, it's healthy to acknowledge those feelings exist and to let yourself feel them. What's important, though, is what comes after. Once you've let yourself feel those feelings and you've let yourself be upset or numbed by those, is to go, okay, what if instead I feel angry about the fact that things are the way they are? What if I look at this in a more energizing and I can do something and have agency manner? But also, as we sort of get to, it's not feeling like you're alone in that fight, and taking the time to remind yourself there are other people who are aware of how bad things are getting and who are trying to do things to fix the state of things, and you are going to have a much better chance of not burning out if you work with other people to change the status quo. And I think that's sort of where our, like, let yourself feel the nihilism, but then move past it, look for objective things you can do, find hope in the fact that as much as it might feel like you're the only one who cares about this, you're not alone, and there is strength in the fact that other people are paying attention.
I very much like, that's why I sort of said earlier that I do find hope in this novel. It's not like, you know, this is the way to fix everything, but you do provide a way to, like, here's how we direct this in a way that feels productive and can possibly, like, work to start combating this horrible system and culture. And I do think you end the novel, I think, in a really great way on that sort of note. That's not like everything's solved, but here is a way forward that feels like it's productive and helpful, and in working with people, not just by yourself.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, go ahead.
So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I've lost it.
Oh, sorry.
ADHD.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps that this book released when it did. In that we, as Jane said earlier, we originally drafted this book before we were starting to see QA worker unions popping up, starting with ABK Workers Alliance, and now becoming more and more frequent occurrences in the industry. And what we wrote as a very hopeful but like quite optimistic and not necessarily grounded in where the industry actually was story, thankfully released at a time where it felt, I would say, very timely. There weren't many better times it could have released in terms of making its ending feel like a realistic path to hope.
I'm wanting to keep up a sense that things were going to get better, because obviously I think if the story had been longer or had been set on a longer timeline, the main character absolutely would have got up and started again, probably in a similarly wrong-headed way, but she would have kept going. And I again, as I said, we didn't want to have a proper solution, but we did want to have some hope, and I hope we captured that.
I think you very much did. And I think on that note, I think that's a great place to sort of wrap out the discussion. Is there anything that I didn't touch upon that you both were just like, oh, I really wanted to talk about this aspect of the novel, and get out there?
Oh, I think you nailed everything. That was wonderful.
Oh, it was great. Yeah, I'll just toss it to both of you to just promote yourselves. But for me, just wrapping out, I really loved this book. I thought it was really great. Like I said, I thought it was very funny, but also gave me a lot of anxiety in a way that I think was very good. That, like, because I think it spoke to something very true of not only the video game industry, but, like, again, corporate culture writ large. So I think it's a great book, and I highly recommend it to everyone listening. But yeah, I'll toss it to both of you to sort of, like, promote yourselves. Where can people find you? What do you want to promote other than the book? Things like that. Yeah.
You can find me at Laura K Buzz on most places that have usernames. On YouTube, every Friday, I upload episodes of Accessibility, which is a series about accessibility in the video game industry, where we try and sort of take a look at what can be done to make video games more accessible to disabled players. I have various podcasts you can go listen to, including Queer and Pleasant Strangers that I do with Jane, Podquisition, Dice Funk, which is a Dungeons and Dragons real play podcast. We've just started a new campaign. Each season's its own self-contained story. The most recent one is season 10 and it's just kicked off, so it's a great place to jump in. Just generally Laura K. Buzz everywhere. Patreon is what pays the bills, so that's Laura K. Buzz.
Yeah, we couldn't all get unified branding, so I have a link tree. That's linktree.ee/Janiac, Janiac. You can find my music, the t-shirts I designed, including the one with the guillotine that says Wealth Inequality Solutions. You can find yes, music, all the things I write, and my Patreon is patreon.com/stonedmonkeyradio.
Awesome. Well, listeners, please go support both of them because they are wonderful, and you gotta support the train lesbians. But yeah, this was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for writing this book. Just for so listeners have it again right at the end here. Who Hunts the Whale? It's great. Also, the cover art is wonderful. I thought it was very cool.
Tactile.
Yeah, I loved it. I loved it so much. So even just for the art, you should get it. But the book is great, and I will leave you all there. So to everybody, live long and prosper.